Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kurkoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 17, the championship final week of our 2023 season. Now, of course, after which I'll transition into talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual wide receiver, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings as we approach Week 17. Again, if you guys are looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you appreciate the timestamps, all the content, be sure to click the like button and, of course, subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about quarterback and tight end rankings. Saturday, we'll have a live stream prior to the Dallas versus Detroit game. And, of course, Sunday morning, like we do every single Sunday morning, I'll be live streaming with up-to-date rankings in order to help you set your lineups and, of course, capture a championship. And for those of you who have a Week 18 championship, unfortunately, on the horizon, of course, I'll still be here next week to help to the best of my ability. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about matchups at the wide receiver position for Week 17. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, I've gone ahead and isolated wide receiver receiving statistics allowed from defenses against opposing wide receivers from weeks 5 through 16 in order to determine the most advantageous matchups based on receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns allowed in a half PPR scoring format. We find that the Philadelphia Eagles, Washington Commanders, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Detroit Lions, Jacksonville Jaguars, teams who have been at the top of this conversation for quite some time, continue to give up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. Therefore, we want to take advantage of these overall matchups going into a given week. Now, on the other end of this overall spectrum, some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the given week are accompanied by teams like the New York Jets, the Colts, the Falcons, the Broncos, the Saints. Now, in some of these overall scenarios, you can find a lot of success at the wide receiver position, even though these secondaries haven't given up incredible performances as of late. I mean, we just saw Puka Nacua last week absolutely torch this New Orleans Saints secondary. Demarcus Robinson scored a touchdown, and if it wasn't for the fact that Cooper Kupp dropped 2 touchdowns, he would have had himself an incredible game. So it's not impossible to play well against these difficult matchups, but overall, in terms of their coverage, in terms of their overall recent performances, these defenses have played relatively well against opposing wide receivers. Therefore, I just wanted to go ahead and present these statistics because I will refer back to them over the course of today's episode. Okay, with that all covered, let's transition into talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Before I do so, a reminder, rankings are subject to change. Between now and Sunday, rankings are absolutely going to change because there are still players like Ja'Marr Chase that I'm not 100% certain on as to whether or not he's going to potentially play. Michael Pittman Jr. technically still in the concussion protocol. We have to keep an eye on that. So keep in mind, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can either travel down to the description of the video and check out the Patreon, or you can sign up today using code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up, make a first-time deposit, minimum of $10. Not only will you get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you'll get my rankings sent to you this upcoming Sunday morning. And, of course, for Week 18, if in fact you play them. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings. So take advantage of the opportunity. For those of you wondering if you're eligible, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. Draft some teams via Underdog Fantasy responsibly. Put together some pick'em slips. And, of course, if you sign up before Saturday's game, you can take advantage of the new customer special, Dak Prescott 0.5 total yards. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about wide receivers going into Week 17, beginning with CeeDee Lamb on number 1. Short and sweet and simple, you automatically start CeeDee Lamb in every single scenario, especially considering the fact that he has scored 10 touchdowns in the last 10 games he has played. He takes on the Detroit Lions, which is a top-tier matchup, and most recently, wide receivers against this defense have dominated. I'm talking about Justin Jefferson, 6 catches, 141 and a touchdown, while in the same game, KJ Osborn, 5 catches for 95 and a touchdown. DJ Moore, 6 catches for 68 and a touchdown. Chris Olave, 5 for 119. Christian Watson, 5 for 94 and a touchdown. Those are just the most recent performances against the Detroit Lions secondary. Of course, CeeDee Lamb should be able to impose his will this upcoming Saturday. Number 2, we have Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill without Jaylen Waddle over the course of this season has been an unstoppable force for fantasy football purposes. In the last 8 games in which Tyreek Hill has played with Jaylen Waddle, and Jaylen Waddle has either left the game early due to an injury or played a very low percentage of overall snaps. I'm talking about 65 or less percentage of the offensive snaps within that given game, which again, we've seen on multiple occasions over the course of the season. I can think of 4 off the top of my head in which Jaylen Waddle has left the game due to an injury and not returned. In those circumstances, Tyreek Hill's averaging 23.05 half PPR fantasy points per game. In the one game this season in which, Jaylen Waddle was outright completely absent because of the concussion protocol, in that game, we, of course, saw Tyreek Hill put up 26.2 fantasy points. The assumption is that Jalen Waddle with the hamstring injury is not going to play. Leaves a lot of potential for Tyreek Hill to get himself double-digit targets and, of course, a huge load of fantasy success within the given week. Our number 3 is Justin Jefferson. He's got back-to-back games of 10-plus targets, which is extremely promising. On top of that, unfortunately, Jordan Addison's dealing with an injury, and on top of that, TJ Hawkinson is out for the rest of the season, unfortunately, with a season-ending ACL, MCL injury. That all being taken into account, on top of the fact that they take on the Green Bay Packers, an advantageous matchup. The Packers most recently giving up 6 catches, 98, and 2 touchdowns to DJ Chark. Just putting that into perspective, in the same game, Adam Thielen, 6 catches for 94. The week prior, Chris Godwin, 10 catches for 155, while Mike Evans, 4 catches for 57 and a touchdown. We have seen wide receivers dominate against the secondary, all on top of the fact that Jair Alexander, the primary number 1 cornerback of the Green Bay Packers, has been suspended for this upcoming Sunday's game against the Minnesota Vikings because of actions detrimental to the team. Either way, this makes it that much easier for Justin Jefferson to have himself an explosive performance against a division rival. Our number 4 is Amon-Ra St. Brown. In the last 2 weeks, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been fantastic. He's been able to surpass over 100 receiving yards in both those games and score a receiving touchdown in both those contests. That is exactly what we want to see every single week with Amon-Ra St. Brown because we know he's capable of achieving that in every single game. This upcoming week, again, they do take on the Dallas Cowboys, and at times over the course of the season, it has been a difficult matchup, but primarily for slot receiving options, is an advantageous matchup. Over the course of this season, Jordan Lewis, the primary nickel cornerback of the Dallas Cowboys, has given up the 7th most receptions, 4th most receiving yards, and 5th most receiving touchdowns to opposing slot receiving options. Therefore, I expect Amon-Ra St. Brown to continue his streak of success into this week's contest in a must-win game. Number 5, to close out the S tier, we have Deebo Samuel. Even though Deebo Samuel and his overall touchdown streak of games came to a screeching halt last week with an unfortunate 7.4 fantasy points, he still ended up getting himself 12 total targets, 10 of which came with Brock Purdy in the game, of course, prior to Brock Purdy leaving the game due to his injury. 10 targets is a lot going in the direction of Deebo Samuel, and I anticipate this team to go ahead and recalibrate from their loss against the Baltimore Ravens and take it out on the Washington Commanders secondary. They are literally the second best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 35 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format in just receiving statistics isolated. It doesn't accompany for the potential of Deebo Samuel rushing for a touchdown. Either way, Deebo Samuel in one of the more advantageous matchups, continuing to get himself a high volume of targets, should be a fantastic play against Washington. Number 6 is A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, 4 consecutive games of 10-plus targets. Of course, the opportunity is going to continue to be there. And the only reason I really have him ranked as high as I currently do, even though there could be a potential in which he does have another one of these, 10, 11, 12-point performances and is not going to be in the top 6 to 7 conversation of the wide receiver position, is mainly because of what he has done over the course of this season. These rankings for these kind of wide receivers of this caliber is based on the consistency that they have played with over the course of the season. Now, even though I do believe that the Arizona Cardinals matchup is an advantageous one, they're giving up, nearly 28 fantasy points per game on average in the last 11 games to opposing wide receivers, which is more than enough to go ahead and allow A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith to have themselves fantastic performances. But in this current circumstance, I don't really think that A.J. Brown is going to be in the conversation of being a top 6 overall wide receiver. But going into week 17, if he's on your roster, you have to start him because what he has accomplished over the course of the season. And we know he's always capable of jumping into the top 5 conversation. It's just a matter of, are the touchdowns going to accompany his performance? Number 7, we have Mike Evans. Speaking of touchdowns accompanying their performance, Mike Evans with another week in which he scored a touchdown, but not just one touchdown, he ended up scoring a second. Mike Evans over the course of this season has been unbelievably good. And of course, Baker Mayfield has elevated him into this conversation, but this week, he has one of his toughest tests of the season. He takes on the New Orleans Saints. Like we've talked about in seasons past and weeks past, anytime Mike Evans takes on the New Orleans Saints, there's just some bad juju that surrounds him. Since 2019, in games in which Mike Evans has played against the New Orleans Saints, he's averaging 6.52 fantasy points per game in the last 9 games in which he's played against them. One of which of those games earlier this season, he left due to an injury, and the other in which he was suspended because he was fighting Marshawn Lattimore. Now, there is a potential going into this week in which Marshawn Lattimore is not activated off the injured reserve and is not going to be suiting up against the New Orleans Saints. But even in the 2 games in which Marshawn Lattimore, over the course of the last 9 matchups against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in which he was not active, so there wasn't a Lattimore-Evans matchup. even in those games where Evans had a different cornerback covering him, only put up 8.9 and 7.9 fantasy points. It is a tough matchup, but we're going to hope that the absence of Marshawn Lattimore and the fact that the New Orleans Saints as a defense as a whole have been struggling a lot is going to lend to Mike Evans having himself a solid performance and hopefully finding himself in the end zone. Number 8, we have Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, if it wasn't for the fact that he literally dropped 2 touchdowns on the first 2 red zone drives of the game, I mean, he could have very easily had himself a 20-point performance. No questions would have been asked. None of us would have been complaining. But instead, we had Cooper Kupp dropping touchdowns and Puka Nacua catching touchdowns. And that really hurt many of us last week. Now, if you manage to survive that overall Thursday game and the lackluster performance of Cooper Kupp, then we move on to this week against the New York Giants, an advantageous matchup. But the fact of the matter is, Cooper Kupp continues to dominate the overall target share within this overall offense. He continues to out-target Puka Nacua in all these circumstances, and as long as he's going to continue to maintain as one of the favorite targets of Matthew Stafford, who's been playing on fire as of late, it's kind of a no-brainer that we're automatically starting him in these circumstances. Now, when we continue on with this conversation of the LA Rams, we have to mention Puka Nacua because even though he has been up and down, and over the course of the last 6 consecutive games, he's been able to surpass 7+ targets in those games. Sure, those are okay numbers, but he's been up and down. There's been 3 of the last 6 contests where he's been over 15 fantasy points, and the other 3 obviously going to be in the single-digit conversation. So if we're going to be in a situation in which we're going to have ourselves the up and down potential of Puka Nacua either having himself 8 points or 18 points, you kind of have to take the risk. You have to take the gamble and you have to start them. They take on the Giants, who are the 7th best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 30.9 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in the last 11 games in terms of receiving statistics isolated. Both these guys must start options. Now let's close out the A tier by talking about Ja'Marr Chase. Right before I started recording this video, there was information released that Ja'Marr Chase did in fact practice earlier today on Thursday. So if in fact we're going to be in a situation which Ja'Marr Chase, even though he's been dealing with that shoulder injury, is going to return from the injury and be a present part of the offense, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, who he has put up incredible fantasy performances against over the course of the last couple seasons, the expectation is that if in fact he's suiting up, he's in my starting lineup as one of the best wide receivers that I could potentially start within a given week. Moving on, let's talk about our number 11, Chris Olave. In the last 6 games, Chris Olave is averaging 15.15 half PPR fantasy points per game. He's coming off a week in which he set a season high in total receptions and receiving yards. What more can we ask from Chris Olave? Even though he was coming off of the injury, 13 targets, 9 catches, 123, 18.8 fantasy points. Takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, a division rival in the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position, an automatic play. Number 12, to close out the wide receiver 1 conversation, we have Michael Pittman Jr. Yes, he is still in the concussion protocol, but hopefully he can go ahead and clear it prior to Sunday's game. In the last, again, 9 games in which he has played with a healthy Gardner Minshew, and of course he has maintained his health, in 8 of those games he's been able to surpass 8 or more receptions. Over the course of those 8 games, averaging 14.7 half PPR fantasy points per game. Michael Pittman Jr. has been playing incredibly well, obviously with Gardner Minshew as his starting quarterback. So regardless of the matchup, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, who have played relatively well as a defense as of late, I still trust that Michael Pittman Jr. can deliver a strong performance in our championship games. Number 13, we have Brandon Aiyuk. Speaking of consistency, besides a guy like Chris Olave, Michael Pittman Jr., who've been doing consistently as of late, Brandon Aiyuk is in that same conversation. In 7 of the last 8 games, Brandon Aiyuk has been able to surpass 12 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And he continues to get himself a lot of utilization near the red zone. And if he can score himself a touchdown this week against Washington, it wouldn't be a surprise, especially considering every wide receiver that has played against this secondary has played relatively well. I mean, even last week, even the Jets offense with Trevor Siemian at quarterback, they still got themselves a lot of involvement out of Garrett Wilson and even another wide receiver on this team. I don't even know the guy's name. I think it was Brownlee, scored a touchdown. The Commanders are the 2nd best matchup at the wide receiver position for a reason. I expect, of course, the San Francisco 49ers offense to take out their frustrations on that defense. Number 14, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper's coming off of a ridiculous performance. Of course, he set the single game receiving record in Cleveland Browns history with 265 receiving yards, 11 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns, and a memorable 46 fantasy points. Again, these are legendary performances that take place every single year. You never know who it's going to be, but Amari Cooper delivered an unbelievable performance. Over the course of the last 3 games with Joe Flacco, he's been able to garner himself a 29% target share, which is a fantastic number. As long as he continues to get himself double-digit opportunity on a weekly basis, of course, he's going to find success. But tonight, they take on the New York Jets. Not only are they the most difficult matchup, but of course, they got some pretty good cornerbacks there. I'm going to go ahead and give Amari Cooper the benefit of the doubt, especially considering we have Joe Flacco against his former team. We have to remember that Joe Flacco has a familiarity with the Jets defense. He played for the Jets last season. He was the practice squad quarterback in a lot of these overall scenarios, so he had himself daily practices against that number 1 defense. He is familiar with their overall scheme. He knows how to take them on as he's done it at practice. My assumption is that Joe Flacco could put together a solid performance here with Amari Cooper. We just have to hope that Amari Cooper is healthy and ready to go before kickoff. On number 15, we have Rashee Rice. Man, Rashee Rice has been incredible, even though he's coming off of, a lackluster performance of only 8.7 fantasy points. I'm not even going to be mad at the performance. 12 total targets, 6 catches, 57 receiving yards. All that really matters in my mind there is the 12 total targets. As long as Patrick Mahomes continues to trust him, and he is clearly the number 1 receiving option of this offense, even ahead of Travis Kelce, that is all I can ask for. And going into this weekend's matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals, I anticipate that Rashee Rice gets back on track. He's been averaging 14.82 half PPR fantasy points per game in the last 5 games. He's a must-start option in 5 consecutive weeks of 9+ targets. Again, if the opportunity is there, it's only going to lead to success for fantasy purposes. Number 16, we have Zay Jones, another one of these rookie wide receiver options who has been incredible as of late. In the last 5 games in which he has started, where Mark Andrews has been absent over the course of this season, we have seen him put up 13.2, 20.7, 17.0, 1.2, and 17.7. 4 of the 5 games over 13 fantasy points, averaging 13.96 throughout that span of time without Mark Andrews in the lineup. In 4 of those 5 games, 8+ targets. The opportunities are there. The touchdown upside is certainly there. And of course, the yardage is continuing to build. He's coming off a performance against a great defense like the 49ers, in which he had 13 targets, 9 catches, 72 and a touchdown. If he could put up another great performance against the Miami Dolphins, it would not surprise me. I'm expecting success here, once again, from Zay Flowers. Number 17, the thumbnail of today's episode, is Stefon Diggs. I would love to trust Stefon Diggs. And honestly, I kind of do going up against the New England Patriots, but I rank him as low as number 17 because I can understand the hesitancy in comparison to the other options that I've already mentioned. Now, in regards to Stefon Diggs, in the last 4 games in which he's played against the New England Patriots, and the reason why I bring up this, because of course they play against the Patriots this week, but in the last 4 games, he's averaging 17.85 fantasy points per game against that defense. He scored a touchdown in each of those 4 games against the New England Patriots over the course of the last couple seasons here. Now, over the course of the last 5 games, we've only seen Stefon Diggs averaging about 8.6 targets per game, while in the 4 games against the New England Patriots, averaging 11 targets per game, 44 in those 4 games. There has definitely been a huge decrease in terms of his overall opportunity. And even though this is an advantageous matchup, the overall offensive coordinator change that we have seen from the Buffalo Bills, going from Ken Dorsey to, of course, Joe Brady, has absolutely impacted Stefon Diggs. So again, I'm not upset if, in fact, you opt away from Stefon Diggs, but going into this week, I think it is a solid enough matchup to be able to trust him in this overall ranking capacity. Number 18 is Nico Collins. Nico Collins hopefully will get CJ Stroud back. We are not 100% certain if that is going to be the case, but we know that they do take on the Tennessee Titans, which is one of the best matchups at the position, allowing 29 fantasy points per game. They are the 10th best matchup at the position, so why not go ahead and fire up your wide receivers against that defense? Now, if in fact CJ Stroud is active, I would probably move up Nico Collins just a little bit more in terms of my overall rankings, in terms of my confidence, because from weeks 9 through 13, throughout that span of time prior to Nico Collins' injury, we saw Nico Collins averaging 9.3 targets, 6.5 receptions, 103.5 receiving yards, 0.75 touchdowns, and 18.1 fantasy points per game with CJ Stroud. So if in fact they're both active, healthy, and ready to go against Tennessee, I would assume Nico Collins will be an even better play within the given week. Number 19, we have Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin, 3 consecutive games of 11+ targets. Again, when the head coach and the offensive coordinator come out and they say, we're going to get him the ball, I'm going to take their word, because that's exactly what they have done over the course of the last 3 games. Now, in comparison to earlier this season, he's been far more consistent. And this week, he takes on the New Orleans Saints. Typically, again, like I mentioned earlier with Mike Evans finds himself struggling a lot within the overall matchup. Earlier this year against the New Orleans Saints, Chris Godwin, 11 targets, 8 catches, 114, 15.4 fantasy points. We're hoping for another big performance in that overall circumstance, especially considering Mike Evans is probably going to be double teamed for the entirety of that game. Number 20 is Jayden Reed. Assuming that Jayden Reed is healthy and ready to go, like I mentioned last week, of course, in the same wide receiver rankings video, if in fact Jayden Reed is ready, you got to remember that weeks 10 through 15, in those 6 games, he was averaging 13.57 fantasy points per game. And in 5 of those 6 games that he played, he was able to surpass 13 or more fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We know that he's currently being designated with a toe/chest injury on the injury report. As for the severity, obviously we know that it forced him to miss last week, but if in fact he's going to continue to miss more time, we would then move up players like, Dontavion Wicks and of course Romeo Doubs into the top 30 conversation. But until then, Jayden Reed, hopefully he's ready to go against the Minnesota Vikings. Number 21, we have DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith, only 5 targets in each of the last 2 games, in comparison to the 4 prior games to that, all of which, of course, we had an absence of Dallas Goedert. He was able to get himself 8+ targets in every single game. Now, unfortunately, the opportunity hasn't been at the highest level, but he's still coming off a performance in which he was able to do the most with his overall opportunities. 5 targets, 4 catches, 79 and a touchdown. This week they take on the Arizona Cardinals. It is the 13th best matchup. They're allowing nearly 28 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which, like I mentioned with A.J. Brown, is more than enough for both these wide receivers to absolutely be relevant wide receiver 1s or wide receiver 2s within the given week. Number 22 is DK Metcalf. Look, I love DK Metcalf just as much as anybody. And over the course of the last 5 games in which he has played with Geno Smith, he has been incredible, averaging 16.78 fantasy points per game, 5 touchdowns throughout that 5-game span. Now, of course, a lot of those touchdowns and a lot of those fantasy points coming from one singular game against the Dallas Cowboys. We know that DK Metcalf is probably a solid 10 to 12 points in a half PPR scoring format. And truly, that's what I'm anticipating to see this week. Anything more than that would be fantastic. Anything less than that, that would be, relatively unfortunate, but that's what I'm anticipating. I think 10 to 12 points is a perfect spot for him, even though those were the numbers he was putting up with Drew Lock, and we do anticipate a little bit more with Geno Smith at quarterback. I do think this is a solid position and current ranking for DK Metcalf. Moving on to 23, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore's been struggling over the course of the last 2 games. Pretty underwhelming performances and mainly pretty underwhelming numbers in terms of overall target share. You would assume that as the number 1 receiving option of this offense, when they haven't really been giving up any other targets to other wide receivers. I guess Darnell Mooney has got himself a higher share of overall targets as of late, even though he hasn't caught majority of them. Even though that is the case, I would still assume that DJ Moore should be able to get himself 8 to 10 targets every single week. And the fact that he's coming off a performance of 6 targets, 3 catches, and only 18 receiving yards against the Arizona Cardinals, one of the more advantageous matchups. I understand the team ran the ball down their throat and they maintained a lead, so they didn't really have to throw. But this week, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, we could see a little bit of a shift here. The Atlanta Falcons have a significantly better run-stopping defense than, of course, the Arizona Cardinals. It may force them to struggle in terms of running the ball and then eventually passing the ball a little bit more. Hopefully that is going to be the case, and Justin Fields can look in the direction of his number 1 receiving option, DJ Moore. Number 24, we have Davante Adams. He's coming off a performance in which he had literally 1 reception. The offense for the Las Vegas Raiders did not complete a pass after the first quarter. Now, with this all said, there have been number 1 wide receivers that have found themselves success against the Indianapolis Colts as of late. Deontay Johnson, 4 catches, 62 and a touchdown. DeAndre Hopkins, 5 for 75 and a touchdown. Mike Evans, 6 for 70 and 2 touchdowns. There's always the potential of wide receiver 1 finding themselves success against the Indianapolis Colts secondary. Hopefully that can be the case for Davante Adams this week. Otherwise, the number 24 spot is safe because we know that we have to start Davante Adams because of his capabilities. But he's low enough because, again, the quarterback he's associated with doesn't guarantee much success within every single matchup he takes on. Number 25 is Terry McLaurin to close out the D tier. Terry McLaurin with the quarterback shift should have himself far more success for fantasy purposes. In every single drive that Jacoby Brissett has played this season, it has led to a touchdown. If I'm not mistaken, Jacoby Brissett has the highest passer rating amongst all quarterbacks this season. Pretty ridiculous numbers. So I do anticipate that this offense, even though they do take on the San Francisco 49ers, to find success. Most recently, we have seen wide receivers like Flowers, 972 and a touchdown. Lockett, 6 for 89. Metcalf, 252 and a touchdown. A.J. Brown, 8 for 114. DeVonta Smith, 9 for 96 and a touchdown. Wide receivers have succeeded against the 49ers as of late. I anticipate to see more of the same with Terry McLaurin within the matchup this week. Number 26, we have T. Higgins. I had T. Higgins a little bit higher ranked earlier on today, but obviously the information as of Ja'Marr Chase participating in practice earlier today helped me, kind of readjust the rankings, and I did move down T. Higgins in this overall regard. Now, if in fact Ja'Marr Chase's overall practice today is just smoke and mirrors, and it's nothing really to be worried about because he's not going to play this upcoming weekend, then T. Higgins is back into a, significantly higher overall ranking. Considering the last 5 games he's played without Ja'Marr Chase, he's averaging 16.92 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of back-to-back performances with Jake Browning in which he has scored at least 1 touchdown. So as long as he continues to build a rapport with Jake Browning, even the return of Ja'Marr Chase may continue to lead to T. Higgins finding success, especially if, in fact, Ja'Marr Chase on the opposite side of the field is pulling primary number 1 coverage and, in, some circumstances, double coverage. Moving on to our number 27, we have Calvin Ridley. Now, if, in fact, Trevor Lawrence was active, I'd have Calvin Ridley a little bit slightly higher. But with C.J. Beathard, it is going to be a little bit of a tough matchup, especially going up against the Carolina Panthers. I understand that the Carolina Panthers, as of late, have given up pretty solid performances to wide receivers. I mean, Dontavion Wicks and Romeo Doubs both scored a touchdown against them last week. Olave, 4 catches, 28 and a touchdown. Mike Evans, 7 catches, 162 and a touchdown. CeeDee Lamb, 6 catches, 38 and a touchdown. Wide receivers have found themselves success against the Carolina Panthers. So it's not out of the realm of possibility in which Calvin Ridley could do so. I mean, he's coming off a week in which he had 6 catches, 90, and 2 touchdowns. Of those overall stats, 3 targets, 2 catches, 14 receiving yards, and 1 of those receiving touchdowns with C.J. Beathard as the starting quarterback. But outside of that, C.J. Beathard purely did prefer to throw the ball to Evan Ingram and really nobody else. So going into this weekend's matchup, Calvin Ridley, a lesser option because the quarterback play is going to be at a discount. Moving on to number 28, we have George Pickens. George Pickens this season, in the 3 games in which he has had 8 or more targets, he's been able to surpass 100 or more receiving yards in each of those 3 games. And in those 3 games, averaging 19.17 fantasy points per game. Just putting it into perspective, if you give him opportunity, it'll probably lead to success. Now, back in week 16, he only had 6 targets, but still had himself 4 catches, 195, and 2 receiving touchdowns. We know that Mason Rudolph has been named the starter once again this week. They do take on the Seattle Seahawks, whose secondary has struggled at times over the course of the season. It's purely just a matter of, are you willing to gamble your championship with George Pickens? Some will, some will not. Me, I'm okay with him as a middle of the pack wide receiver 3. Moving on to number 29, we have Garrett Wilson. Trevor Siemian at quarterback did lead to a lot of targets. 15 is a ridiculous number, but this week, tonight, they take on the Cleveland Browns at home. The Cleveland Browns, Denzel Ward, they are the toughest matchup that you could possibly find going into a given week, especially considering how much better they are at home in comparison to on the road. My assumption is that Garrett Wilson will have his hands full as the number 1 receiving option of this offense next to probably Breece Hall. They're probably going to make sure that they stop them both in their tracks by double covering Garrett Wilson and making sure there's a linebacker always covering Breece Hall in every circumstance. Maybe they bring down a safety into the box and have him cover Breece Hall. Either way, I do anticipate that Garrett Wilson is going to find himself struggling because of the coverage, but he will be given enough opportunity to make himself fantasy relevant and in wide receiver 3 capacity. Number 30 is Tyler Lockett. I mean, as of the last 5 games he has played with Geno Smith, averaging 10.12 fantasy points per game. They do take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I do believe that DK Metcalf will have a little bit more of a difficult overall experience with the coverage, but he is a more talented wide receiver. He will be given a little bit more opportunity in terms of overall targets, so he'll be able to, sustain. But Tyler Lockett, overall, as long as he continues to see himself opportunity, he has over the course of this season delivered. 8+ targets, you're going to find yourself a lot of success here. So hopefully that's going to be the case. And hopefully this could be a high-scoring matchup between these 2 teams that are both fighting for a playoff position. Number 31 is Noah Brown. Again, if in fact we're in a situation in which CJ Stroud is back, we can find a lot of success here with Noah Brown. Again, earlier this season, there were multiple games in which Noah Brown was able to have himself over 150 receiving yards because of CJ Stroud and because of the other injuries that had taken place within the receiving core. Now that we have no Tank Dell and it's just Nico Collins and Noah Brown, my assumption against the 10th best matchup at the position is that we can find Noah Brown finding success. Last time out against the Tennessee Titans, even with Case Keenum at quarterback, Noah Brown against his defense was able to put up over 18 fantasy points. Number 32, we have Demarcus Robinson. Demarcus Robinson, 4 consecutive games of a receiving touchdown. On top of the fact that Matthew Stafford is on a hot streak, 14 touchdowns in the last 5 games in which he has played. Over the course of this span of time, from weeks 13 through 16, in which, of course, Demarcus Robinson has been scoring touchdowns, he has been the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy football and take on the 7th best matchup at the position. For those of you who are looking for the boom potential play as your wide receiver 3, Demarcus Robinson is perfectly there for this week. Number 33 is KJ Osborn. Again, considering TJ Hawkinson's injured and Jordan Addison is dealing with an injury, there is going to be a situation in which Justin Jefferson and KJ Osborn may be the only two receiving options available for this team, especially considering Nick Mullins has had 700 plus passing yards in the last 2 games, and the defense of the Green Bay Packers will be without Jair Alexander. I think it just makes it that much easier for the Minnesota Vikings wide receivers, or specifically these two wide receivers, Jefferson and KJ Osborn, to find themselves success. Number 34, we have Adam Thielen. Takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're quite literally the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Most recently, Evans, 6 for 86, 2 touchdowns. Amari Cooper, 7 for 77. Chase, 11 for 149 and a touchdown. Nico Collins, 7 for 104 and a touchdown. This could be a DJ Chark revenge game, but if it's not, Adam Thielen should have himself a solid overall performance against a lackluster secondary. Number 35, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Last time out against the Houston Texans in Week 15, he was the number 2 wide receiver amongst all in terms of total air yards. Had 200 total air yards on 9 targets, only had 2 receptions in that game. If, in fact, they continue to air it out in his direction, fantastic. But with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, I don't trust them to get the job done. Let's hope that Will Levis is ready to go by the time we get to Sunday's game. Number 36 is Jerry Jeudy. This is purely under the assumption that there is going to be no Courtland Sutton because he is in the concussion protocol. We already know that Russell Wilson is going to be benched for Jarrett Stidham. Therefore, my expectation is that Jerry Jeudy should be the number 1 receiving option in this offense. And if, in fact, Jarrett Stidham can put up a performance similar to which he did last season in the relief of Derek Carr last season, again, he replaced that quarterback. He's now replacing this veteran quarterback. If we're going to be in a situation in which he's going to be able to come in, make an immediate impact, Jerry Jeudy would be the number 1 option to succeed against the LA Chargers secondary. The final option I wanted to mention is Drake London. Drake London, again, very difficult to trust, mainly because of the quarterback switch, mainly because of the matchup against Chicago, and because, again, Drake London really needs a lot of help in terms of targets to be relevant for fantasy purposes. Until we can get ourselves a consistent streak of, multiple targets, it's tough to trust them, especially in championship week 17. All right, guys, thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with quarterback and, of course, tight end rankings. If you guys are wondering in regards to potentially, who am I playing tonight? Obviously, we have Kupp. We have Garrett Wilson ranked here. We had Jerome Ford and Breece Hall yesterday. David Njoku's an automatic start. And you would know, I feel like you would already know whether you're starting Joe Flacco based on what you have available. I think it kind of speaks for itself as to what kind of a caliber player he's been as of late. But either way, thank you everybody for watching. Good luck tonight. Enjoy the game. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.